Hello, before we get started, let us first introduce ourselves.
My name is Claire Gilroy-Scott and I'm a partner at Goodman Derrick.
My name is Emily Kearsey and I'm a solicitor at Goodman Derrick.
We've recently presented some workshops covering common HR horrors. This is the fourth session in that workshop where we're going to consider the question of whether you can suspend suspicious Sammy and how to carry out a fair suspension. An employee should only be suspended from work in limited circumstances. Suspension may be appropriate when their presence at work may impede the investigation and/or if their presence presents a serious risk to the interests of the business, its customers or employees. Suspension should not be used for other reasons or as a penalty or disciplinary sanction. It is merely a protective measure. A recent case in the courts has highlighted that suspension should not be a knee-jerk reaction every time there is potential for disciplinary action.
So, we know that we should only suspend in limited circumstances, but what other considerations may be relevant? First, consider whether there is an implied right to provide work. So, if Sammy's earnings depend on him being at work, for example, if he is paid on a commission basis or is paid per item he makes, it can potentially be a breach of his right to work if he is suspended. The same can be said when the individual needs to be at work to exercise their skill, i.e. they will be de-skilled if they are kept out of the workplace.
Think also about the implied duty of trust and confidence. As an employer, you need to act reasonably. If not, Sammy may allege a breach of this implied duty, which may lead to a constructive unfair dismissal claim. Suspension should not be for an excessive duration. It should be kept as short as possible and regularly reviewed during its course to check whether it is still necessary and appropriate in the circumstances. It should not cause financial hardship, so Sammy should receive full pay and benefits throughout. So should Sammy be suspended? Clearly this will depend on the circumstances, so we're going to consider some brief situations. And in these, we're going to assume that Sammy is a manager in your business. He is paid a salary, and you have a contractual right to suspend him pending a disciplinary investigation.
So in our first scenario, Sammy is accused of physically threatening a colleague after a falling out. His colleague says he feels in real danger and is scared to come back into the office. Would it be appropriate to suspend Sammy in this situation? Yes, it is appropriate if there is a real risk to the colleague's welfare.
In scenario B, Sammy returns drunk from a client event, and in his state of intoxication, he appears from the CCTV footage to knock over the coffee machine, breaking it and destroying important company documents in the process due to the spilt coffee. In this scenario, is it appropriate to suspend Sammy? Well, probably not, as this behaviour is unlikely to reoccur, so he probably doesn't pose a real threat.
In our third scenario, your receptionist has reported to you that she thinks Sammy is secretly diverting the company's work to his own business. You confront Sammy and he denies it. Should we suspend in this situation? Yes, there is a danger that if Sammy is in the workplace, he might seek to destroy evidence or continue to divert confidential company information, causing a loss of business. So let's assume that we have a situation where it is appropriate to suspend Sammy. How do we practically go about it? First, properly consider whether suspension is really necessary, and if it is, it's sensible to record your reasoning in a file note in case this is needed for evidential purposes later on.
You'll need to convene a meeting with Sammy to explain that he is suspended from work with immediate effect and until further notice. And in this meeting you should explain exactly what suspension means in these circumstances. And this could include that he should not attend the workplace, do any work, contact customers or colleagues, or log on to IT systems, etc., without your prior permission. Try to give an indication to Sammy as to how long the suspension will be for. Explain the reason for the suspension, i.e. that you're investigating a possible disciplinary matter. Explain why you consider suspension is necessary in the circumstances, so it is clear that the decision has been well thought through. Reassure him that this is not a disciplinary sanction and that he will still receive his pay and benefits during the suspension period.
You'll also need to deal with practical issues. For example, think about what his team will be told and how Sammy's work will be covered. You'll need to inform Sammy of the possible outcomes after suspension, which include reinstatement or being required to attend a disciplinary meeting. Make a note of your discussions for evidential purposes, or better still, have a note-taker in the meeting with you when explaining this to Sammy. After the meeting, follow up with a letter detailing the same. Emphasize that suspension is not a form of disciplinary sanction or that there is any implication that Sammy is guilty of misconduct. Finally, it's crucial to periodically consider whether continued suspension is necessary, especially if investigations become more protracted than you first envisaged. And keep a record of your considerations throughout.
Can you compel Sammy to take holiday during his period of suspension? Sometimes employers do resent having to pay an employee during a period of suspension, and generally an employer can compel an employee to take holiday on certain dates. It is usually not sensible to do so during a period of suspension. Firstly, there could be arguments that your request breaches the implied duty of trust and confidence. It can look like you are trying to minimize the amount of accrued holiday payable to him on termination of employment, if that is a possible consequence of the disciplinary process. Secondly, remember that suspension should be for as short a period as possible, and therefore you probably need Sammy readily available to cooperate in your investigations, and you cannot do this if he is on annual leave. Thirdly, remember that the proper purpose of holiday is for rest, relaxation and leisure, which he is unlikely to be able to do with a possible disciplinary process hanging over him.
Finally, we've included a checklist of key points to bear in mind to avoid using suspension as a knee-jerk reaction. Firstly, consider whether Sammy's presence would impede an investigation. Is there a real risk he will interfere with witnesses or evidence? Consider if the safety of other staff or customers is at risk. Think about whether there are suitable alternatives to suspension. And perhaps most importantly, consider whether suspension is reasonable in the circumstances. There was a recent case that considered if a suspension was reasonable, and in that case the employer fell down as they didn't ask the employee of their version of events. So remember to ask your employee. They may have a credible explanation.
That's the end of our session considering whether we can suspend suspicious Sammy. Our next session is about dealing with dishevelled Dinah whilst dodging the discriminatory dress code. In the meantime, please do check out our LinkedIn profiles and follow us on Twitter @EmplawHeroes. Bye.
Goodbye.